And it's my pleasure now to introduce Jane Rosenberg LaForge, who is going to be running the rest of the show, and I'll be here in case anyone needs any technical help. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Zach. First, I want to thank Lee for having me be her MC for the evening. But I just want to say a few things about how we're going to do this, and then we'll do it. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to have Lee read a few poems, and then we're going to introduce a special guest star, see if she wants to say anything. And then I have a bunch of questions for Lee, and they're kind of nerdy craft questions. And I will tell you which page of which book I'm asking about so that you can follow along if you want. And then we'll have some questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please write it down in the chat, and that way I can ask Lee about it when it's time for the questions. And then we'll have Lee read one last poem. And before we start, I just want to say that these poems are fiction, that I may refer to Lee as you and her and she, and as if she's the character speaking here, but it's really a fictional character that is discussing these poems, and just keep that in mind. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do is invite Lee to read some poems from Lifescapes. Take it away, Lee.
First, a huge thank you to the Writers Center. When I was in DC, I rented a workspace there. So I was there every day for 2 years, and many of my poems had their start there. And I will have to say that the Writers Center has done such an amazing job during the pandemic, giving all sorts of free workshops on craft and classes in all genres of writing. It's truly a spectacular place. And some of my inspiring instructors who got me going in poetry are with us tonight. So I'm glad to see you, and thank you for coming. And of course, thanks to Karen, the publisher of Kelsey Books, and Jane for being here to help me stir up the pot. So I'm going to read 3 poems from Lifescapes, a fictional account of the beginning, middle, and end of a marriage during COVID and really difficult global political crises. Vermilion Suit. Friday night, tired, drifting. I almost did not pick up. Your voice, very purposeful. Hello? You answered my ad. Pediatrician, passion for the arts. The conversation rising, we settled on a meeting at the plaza the following Monday. How will I know you? My vermilion suit, I answered. You had to say yes, whether you knew it was a color or not. A tiny corner nook, upscale bar, 2 glasses of Pinot Grigio, teeny dish of salty cashews. First impressions crossed our foreheads. Questions circled our ears. You were reading Amitav Ghosh. I grew up in Bangalore. You were fond of museums. I worked at the Met. Why I dared accept a ride, I do not know. You dropped me off suggesting that you'd enjoy doing something cultural, which sounded vaguely sexual. We went to the Guggenheim. Each anniversary, we always arrived separately, strangely nervous. 7 p.m., October 18th, same hotel for 20 years. Still vermilion, still wondering, will I know you? The second poem is from the middle of the book. It was inspired by the poet C.D. Wright, and refers to a horrible accident that began the crumbling of a marriage for the narrator. It was different than fainting. It's not what you imagine, how darkness covers. You can't know, can you? You pay attention to something else, then it happens while you're watching. A moment before concussion, total concentration on a task, a careful task, the grasping for a grandchild's hand. You step from the tub, resounding thud, head to ledge, lower teeth rattle. You search for sight, yet only hear the child singing. Oh, athlete, no longer will you be sure-footed on the track. No more will you take 2 steps at a time. Between composing countless stanzas, you left the web of family. Blackness drove the lights out. You must know it could happen, flash of a second. The before, the after of forever. And this is a third poem. This is from the end of the book where the narrator, the speaker, feels new hope and a sense of transformation for the future. Strange currency. If I could buy a sunset, I'd be rich in your scent, a dusting of salt and black opium. If I could purchase the memory, I'd wrap it in featherweight lace to keep it almost intangible. If I could retain the passion, I'd think of the moment I blurted, "I love you," and you responded. Ever rich, I'd swim in the tenderness of amplified feeling, up breaths of excitement. I'd replay the evening on the beach, your palms grazing my ribs, smoothing down my hips. For this, I'd pay a gazillion starfish and pockets full of doubloons that chime.
Thank you very much, Lee. Our special guest star is Karen Kelsey of Kelsey Books, who published these poems. And I'm just wondering if there's anything she'd like to say about why she published them and what attracted her to these poems and to this book.
Well, one thing I really like about Lee's work is it's very easy to understand. And she has a lot of interesting situations and beautiful words and nice metaphors. And one thing I really liked at the end of the release, she worked on a book trailer with me and picked out some beautiful pictures. And was it the last poem that you read that was on the trailer? Yeah, it was really nice. And so I don't know, her work's really polished and she's easy to work with. And I'm really happy that we got a chance to meet.
Okay, thank you. Well, now I'm going to ask some questions that will reveal what I like about Lee's poetry. And the first thing I want to mention, though, is that these poems are about 2020, dissolution of a marriage, everything that happened in 2020, the COVID, the impeachment, the political upheaval. And we tend to think of these things in a linear way. First this happened, then that happened. But you have chosen an elliptical, non-linear form or method for telling the story. And I'm wondering why. Why don't you just write a novel about what happened? Why poetry for this particular subject?
Well, 2020 was not linear for me, like prose might be. I felt a tremendous amount of back and forthing given a separation, COVID, a Zoom divorce, one of the first in DC, and moving to New York State after 45 years in a city that I adored. And actually, I've only been writing poetry for the last 6 years. I haven't been writing prose, even though that's what I did during my whole career. Well, prose and radio and television scripts and exhibition programs and so forth for museums. But I love the challenge of poetry. I like the compactness of it and the thrill of wordplay. And there's a mystery and surprise in it because I start off and usually in some kind of realistic situation, and I have no idea where the poem's going to run off to.
Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask in a kind of general way is you have said before that you consider poetry the culmination of all the arts that you've worked in. You've worked in the visual arts, you've been a dancer, you're familiar with music, you do a lot of phrastic poetry, which is based on paintings and other pieces of art. So I'm wondering, when I ask you these questions, can you tell us which art corresponds to which poem?
Sure, if I can.
So for example, in Lifescapes on page 49, if you are following along, there's sort of an American haiku for a Catskill mountain home. And this poem for me ends on the very last line, or actually the very last word. And I'll just mention how it goes from, I've been outpaced and defeated by weeds in my path, stony unpaved gravel roadway, nicely rolled in May, now cheers on, bull thistle, watchless crabgrass. And that crabgrass for me seals the poem. So I'm wondering, which art are you referring to there, or you're inspired by with that particular poem? How did you know to end it on that crabgrass, the sound of that word, and the meaning as well?
Well, it was all about sibilants and S's, and this poem is drawn from rhythm and music. But just a little bit of context, my parents were really interested in all the arts, and my sisters and I grew up overseas for a big chunk of our childhood, and our parents introduced us to everything, to dance, music, street theater, parades, bazaars, paintings, sculptures. And so I think I draw on all of that in the poems, certainly sounds with words and movement with words. And just to say about American haiku, it was actually Allen Ginsberg's format rather than haikus in the Japanese way of haiku or tanka that have certain word lengths, word numbers. He had the idea to make long lines based on numbers of syllables. And so that's what I took. And I made the rhythm in 3 stanzas of repeating a certain kind of parallel structure. And then plants followed each one. And so I've been enchanted and beguiled. I've been overtaken and outmaneuvered. I've been outpaced and defeated by weeds. And the last 3 weeds were bull thistle, oxalis, crabgrass.
Well, I just want to point out that you said, I've been outpaced and defeated by weeds in the path, so that when you come to crabgrass, you have a great rhyme there. And that's something that I noticed. Now, this is a different kind of choice of words. In the poem Zodiac on page 50, you're conflating the literal with the figurative, which I think really pumps up the poem. You can read the poem if you like, but you use the word eclipse in the line, marriage eclipsed by a fall while caring for young children. And that word eclipse has so much power because of its multiple meanings. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how you came to that word and what you're thinking of art-wise when you're using that word and writing this particular poem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I started by collecting words related to space and astrology and zodiacs in different countries, and then composed metaphors having to do with loss. And eclipse seemed like such a strong word for an ending, a kind of a closing down of light and an entry into darkness. Yeah, the words are our problem, born earthbound, extends outward to the universe. We counted on permanence, then meteors hit. Marriage eclipsed by a fall while caring for children. Concussion of stars. I only blinked black. So, this all actually relates back to a personal experience I had, although the book is kind of a pastiche and a composite of different relationships and marriages and so forth. But in 2017, I did have a terrible accident while tending to 3 of my grandchildren in a whirlpool tub. They had come to visit, and I was making sure that we got all the ticks off them. And I was worried about them slipping on the tiles of this raised platform, and told them they had to promise me they would call me when they were ready to get out so I could help them. And I climbed up on the platform and got each of them out, and they went into the bedroom to get dressed. And I stood up and slipped and cracked my head on the cement overhang and tore a hole in the retina and damaged the optic nerve in my eye. So, sometimes a marriage can't survive a death or an accident or a job loss, a loss of self, and so that event was the start of an unraveling of a relationship.
Well, I want to say that, back in the olden days when the moon would block out the sun, it was a catastrophic event. And yet it only lasted a couple of seconds or a half an hour or whatever it was. But people didn't understand what was going on, so they became very upset. And also the sound of the word with the sibilant and the consonant in it, it just does so much work. And then when you talk about the accident, you can see how much heavy lifting that one word is going to be doing. Do you have an art that corresponds to that?
I think that's drama.
Okay. All right.
I would say that's drama. I mean, it certainly was wordplay, but I think it gets darker, and that can often happen in a play.
Okay. Now, there are some other poems. I'm just going to mention them so you can look them up if you want. There's a poem called A Wounded Pastoral. It's on page 62 of Lifescapes, and her collections, page 52. And these poems are another example of where you're comparing, you're conflating the literal and the figurative, particularly in the line monsters I can see you refer to in Wounded Pastoral, and the last line of her collections is plenty of light. How did you come to those words? How did you come to these poems? What was the intentions there when you were starting them?
Well, Jane, in our conversations, you've really made me realize that content always comes first for me, and I'll have an idea, or I'll hear someone say a phrase of some sort, or I'll be thinking of an idea and I sit and I handwrite because I like handwriting. And then it's not in the form of a poem yet. And sometimes I'll do research because I'll want to find out about astrology or space or, whatever it is, whatever the content is. And this was I'm going to just read a few lines of a Wounded Pastoral because it was definitely literal and figurative in the sense of going through COVID and being in Washington when all of a sudden everything was closed down. The National Mall was totally desolate. And, you know, nobody had any idea of what was going to really happen. So this is the end of the poem. No one sits on benches except the homeless man with Tourette's, shouting in spurts that Jesus will save, reaching into his battered grocery cart for a plastic bottle. This has become the not so national mall, for most are otherwise sequestered, sheltering in place. I clean my mask with sanitizer nightly. No time for easy rest. My night dreams vacant. I yearn for monsters I can see, not invisible germs.
That's so great. Now, another poem where you do this is Essence of a Blackbird, and this poem is also in Lifescapes. It's on page 65 and 66, where you refer to a sunken eye, which can be interpreted in many ways. And you also told me in our previous conversations that you got some help from another poet on this one. So if you could talk about the life of this poem and how it came about.
Yeah, she may be here, Alexandra Oliver. She's an incredible Canadian poet who writes formal poetry and taught me a lot about that. And her advice on this was to stop before I had actually stopped. And so I'll tell you about that. Also to say that a lot of my poems are inspired by dreams. I'm a crazy dreamer, really fecund amount of dreams, and I remember them and I write them down. And Essence of Blackbird was absolutely one of those. I had this dream, this enormous blackbird was perched on the headboard of my bed. And that certainly seemed like it was going to be a nightmare. So if you consider it a drama, that would have been Act 1. And then all of a sudden, in Act 2, that deathly omen really turned into a lyrical angel pouring hope into my throat and my heart. And this poem used to have a longer ending, but Alex said, Lee, end on shivering quill. So I'll just read that ending. You bring flocks of calling birds who sing liquid into my throat. No longer restrained by bedclothes, I'm ushered by feathers to high roost. From this perch of silver air currents, streams of white light beckon radiant dawn. Shivering quills.
That's so great. I love how you invert this metaphor that we've all come to, you know, associate with dread and terrible things, and you turn it around and make it into something hopeful. It's really exquisite. And now I'd like to mention a poem from Poemscapes, if I may. This is page 18, if I am correct. Climbing the Rotang Pass. I love this poem because it ends the way it does. When you think it's over, it keeps on going. And then the end is just really hammered in. It really makes a statement. So if you could tell us a little bit about how you got to that perfect ending and which art does that correspond to?
Visual art for sure. Okay. And some drama too. You know, it's just the opposite of Shivering Quills. This one has 3 or 4 endings. And it's actually about a real life experience. I climbed when we lived in India with my parents to the top of a 13,000 foot pass between India and Tibet. before it was China, looking over across into China. I was 11 and it was a 3-day trek. And when I got to the top, I lay down and looked across from India over Tibet and to China. I'll never forget it. So it ends this way. Dad's photo of me when I reached the pass, stretching out prone on top, corduroy pants, woolly jacket, Tibetan hat cap. I felt airborne into China, hovering over mounds of ice. Perhaps those frozen souls below had chosen to stay there. The rush of wind, vast, endless view could drown us all. A sensation of snow under our bellies for the rest of time.
Well, I thought you had an ending in the 5th stanza when you translate what Rotang Pass means, pile of corpses, but then you keep on going. And then when you talk about in the 2nd to the last stanza, perhaps those frozen souls below had chosen to stay there, I was satisfied, but then you took it to the next level with the snow under our bellies for the rest of time. And that's one reason why I like that poem so much. Now, I'm going to change this a little bit back to what we were discussing before. In No More Sugar on page 37 of Lifescapes, you have a poem about, well, you can say what it's about, but it's got all these cooking metaphors. And I'm wondering, did that just come out automatically, or is that something you took a long time to compile? And how did you go about getting all of those things together?
Well, there's a lot of no's there, a lot of repetitions of no's, and that's rhythmical. They keep circling back, almost makes it a dirge. Again, I think rhythm is probably the most important, and it does get darker, as some of the dramatic poems do, when the wordplay with cooking words unfold. No offer to pick me up at the airport. No melting to say, oh, baby, I'm sorry. No digesting the kids' problems together. And then the last line is, after all these years, we are non-stick pans, no baking, microwave silence. Angers like off-kilter mixing bowls spin out of orbit.
Well, the spinning out of orbit it says something about your other poems, which I'll get to in a little bit. But I also want to say, you're talking about the things that you're no longer going to do, and you say, I have no recipes. And then in the next stanza, you'll say, soon we'll just live on air, scant water, which is another great way to end the poem, but you kept on going to the spinning out of orbit. What art are you looking at there? Are you looking at movement and drama? Are you looking, okay, and music perhaps?
I think it's a dancerly poem. It's interesting, mostly I'm reading free verse tonight, but I do many rhyming poems, and those are always very dancerly. But this one somehow has the feel of that, even though it's a free verse poem.
All right, and you say a dirge, and I think of it more, a march is a dirge, but I think of it as a march towards the conclusion with the repetition of the words, and I was just very impressed by that. Now, I made a long list for Lee of all the poems where I thought she made great word choices, but it was too long to share with you here. So if anyone is interested, I have it, and you can contact me, and I will share it with you. For me, and I don't know about other people, but for me, the poem that summarizes everything about 2020 is Waiting, which is on page 30 and 31. And Lee, you said earlier that you didn't really consider 2020 a linear year, or you didn't experience it that way, and that there's mystery and surprise in a poem, which is part of its power. And for me, the mystery is how that poem echoes through other poems in the book. And that's also part of the surprise. And some of the examples I saw in Waiting is rebirth, when parents go away, secrets between a prostitute and an actress, Story Tower, What I Learned in Australia, and Advent. I thought all those poems were stuck into Waiting. And I'm wondering what you consider the common element in those poems, or the common element in the book, if you want to go that far.
Wow. Jane making me run. Well, I think you're spot on. I think Waiting says it all. And I think the period of 2020 through today, everyone was waiting. We all were waiting. We were, the burden of time felt enormous. For me, the personal feelings had to do with leaving my homes, the awful stretch of lawyers and divorce, and then COVID. And I was living on Capitol Hill at that time, and we really weren't sure how the election was going to go. And so the poem is really a bigger metaphor for a world in distress, in uncertainty, despair. So I was going to read the very end of it.
Please do.
It starts in the doctor's office where I was going for follow-up eye exams with the retina specialist, but I wasn't getting better. I still wasn't able to see, and finally found out that this was a permanent situation. But the end of the poem, the doctor says, "The retina looks very good. I'd like to check again in 6 months." Who's 6 months? He forgets I can't read. He did not check the optic nerve, not his universe. The sun is too bright when I try to drive. I cannot decipher the signs on the GPS. World solstices are slipping. My sister thinks it may be the apocalypse. Iran, Pakistan, bombs, a school kid run amok, world water contamination. Back to the checkout desk where patients pay without question. I don plastic glare protectors for dilated pupils. Viewing life anew requires throwing up the pickup sticks, tossing out patterns, creating a cataclysm. The continents must break apart, go dark. I will come back only by tectonic shift.
I just want to say in that last stanza, when you say viewing life anew, the next poem on the next page is A Rebirth, which I really suggest you read. It's on page 34. There's a great ending to that poem. And I didn't notice this before, but when you say, my sister thinks it may be the apocalypse, Iran, Pakistan, bombs, well, what's going on today, right? So you sort of crystallized all the problems of the world for all time, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your point of view. And I have a list of pages where I thought that this poem spoke to other poems in the book, and it's just amazing. Now we have some time for questions from the audience, and if you type in your questions, I can read them to Lee, and she can answer them.
And this is my favorite part. I just love, because there's so many writers and artists and good friends and swimmers and people from all over my life. So please just jump in and make comments, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We want it all. So A Rebirth, Jane, 34.
Yeah.
Okay. And I would just say before we close out for questions and comments that I feel like the poems always belong to the readers in the end. And as you're listening, you're all writing your own poems right alongside of me. And that feels amazing to me. So, Rebirth. I thought I was born on a Friday, September 25th. My mother said I was induced at the Boston Lying In. I find on the internet that it was really a Saturday and wonder if she forgot what day it was. Years ago, I found my way to a vestry basement, West End Lutheran Church. Notice of a seance on Sunday afternoon. Experience rebirth. 2 experts will guide you. Lying on the floor, belly up, I performed breathing exercises. The trance started in the second phase of forceful panting. The fall started before the exhalation was over. Visions, hallucinations, my hands and limbs shook. An image of mom in my third eye. She was the one seeking oblivion. Her doctor agreed to induce her, a vogue of birth at the time. No other plans for that Friday. Unconsciousness to be short-lived. And I was born. Something is lost when teased, enticed, forced out. A child must flip upside down, be cajoled to come, have a cord cut at someone else's bidding. In rebirth, you lose a day of your life, perhaps a Friday.
That is so good. So do we have any questions?
Please.
Please, otherwise I'll just make Lee read more poems. I'm very happy to do that.
Speak, monkeys, speak.
Zach, do you want to, oh, here we go. Okay, someone said read more poems, but let me ask this question. Was creating these recent poems a different experience from the prior ones because the time was more current and perhaps raw?
Yes. My first book was about growing up in India and moving to the States as a teenager. So that was the theme of that book. My second book was about myths, wishes, lies, fantasies. So that is, all these books have the tail end in the title called Scapes. So my sisters think I'm the Scapes artist. Well, I don't know whether that's going to go on forever, but I do think the books are kind of landscapes, either of real geographical places or landscapes of the mind, imagination. Lifescapes was probably the most serious manuscript I wrote, and certainly during the time when the whole world was having just terrible problems. We all still are, in a sense. And so Lifescapes was more of a sequence of problems during that separation, divorce, COVID, election, floods, earthquakes, Afghanistan, all of that. But I do think all 3 books have to do with starting in reality and going into the realm of imagination with memories through time.
Someone just asked, and I want to ask this question because it reminds me of something. Does writing poetry energize or completely exhaust you? And I'm wondering if you are writing poetry to escape whatever is currently happening, perhaps with this Lifescapes collection, and to make it into something that is more palatable or has a reason. Why are all these things happening? You could talk about that for hours and hours and hours, but are you looking for a palatable way out by writing these poems? And so does it energize you or completely exhaust you?
Totally energizes me. I love poetry, and I'm already on to several new books, and you'll be very relieved to hear they're lighter and more whimsical. Although I will say that I feel like my best poetry always has two conflicting voices in it. It will set out a proposition of some sort or a narrative of some sort. And then it is that opposing voice that comes in that to me is the mystery and the excitement of it. And truly, I honestly don't know where that comes from. I feel like the muses are sending me messages. I'm writing ekphrastics all the time about poetry and sculpture because art was, certainly my concern and majors in college and graduate school. But Jane, I never feel drained by it at all. I just feel like, after having a really interesting childhood and then a career I'm very proud of, which went from, teaching to radio to television to museums to being the 12th person in a internet startup during the time when most startups were collapsing. And I just have learned so much, especially at my 20 years at the Smithsonian. Just the chance to meet these experts in art and anthropology and space and biology. It just, just learning. It's been fantastic.
Somebody asked if there was a poetry or a first poetry collection you came across or a poet you came across that left you awe-inspired.
I have a whole book of favorite poets, and, they range from, going way back to Sappho and Rabindranath Tagore and Rumi. But I will say that my first class in poetry was taught by Judith Harris at the Writers Center, and it was in confessional poetry. And so I got very interested in reading Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton and Robert Lowell and on and on and on. And there are many of them today too. But a person that I think of all the time as one of my favorites is Frank O'Hara, who was a curator at MoMA as well as a
interesting.
poet.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he used to hang out with playwrights and musicians. And, to me, that's my idea of heaven, is being in a campground with people from other artistic disciplines, because the vocabularies can be traded off. And that is really, really thrilling. And I will say that some young contemporary artists are so wonderful. Ocean Vuong, Tommy Pico, so many young women, Asian American women and men. And I wish I had my list right here, but I won't go and get it right now. But I would just say that there's no particular artist, although Whitman, Dickinson, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Sharon Olds, there's just Alicia Ostriker. If I look around my apartment, it's all poetry books.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say Frank O'Hara, because he was hanging around with all these people, yet his stuff is very personal, but accessible. And he was a curator, which is kind of like what you are doing. by drawing on all the arts, plus you also worked in a museum or for a museum. So that is very interesting to me. I must remark on it. Someone asked if you can talk about your search for words. Do you have a system for finding the words that you use?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. My best friend is the thesaurus and the dictionary. And I have studied a lot of languages. My first language was actually French because I was 2 when my parents took us to France. And, I knew a little bit at age 1, but then it was a mix. And then in India, we learned kitchen Hindi. We studied in English in school. But since then, I've taken Spanish, I've taken Arabic. I just find the sound of the languages and the introduction to cultures that you sometimes get because English doesn't quite make the same meaning. And I look at a lot of prompts. There are some wonderful journals to ferret and Two Sylvias and Rattle, and they give wonder, and the Poetry Foundation prompts every day, and they often pose a challenge or a question, and I'll think, oh, that reminds me of birds, and I saw this red-tailed hawk today, but I don't know anything about it. So then I'll do all kinds of research about the red-tailed hawk and find out, how big it is and how it hovers and which trees it goes to hide in and how males incubate their babies as well as their female partners and stuff. So it's all an adventure.
Okay, we have time for one last question. And someone asked, how long did it take you to get the Lifescapes manuscript together?
2 years.
2 years, okay. Okay. All right, now there's one last poem I'd like you to read, and it's called Divorce Prayer, and it's in Lifescapes. And that's all I'm gonna say.
This one means a lot to me. And when I was in India, we were visiting my sister Betsy she went to a missionary school in the high Himalayas, and we would go there in the summer to get out of the city heat. And my dad and mom and I had a chance to meet the Dalai Lama the year that he escaped from Tibet. He didn't speak English yet. He was a young man with an interpreter, and my dad, who was in education, asked if he could go visit for a private audience and invited me to come with him. So it has stuck with me forever. And the quote from the Dalai Lama that I start with before the poem is, "Compassion is the radicalism of our time," the Dalai Lama. The title of the poem is Divorce Prayer in Perpetuity Throughout the Universe. May joy be in this void, without money, possessions, accolades. May everyone have fulfillment, even you, even me. Those who aren't skilled at happiness need it desperately. Don't diminish them. It takes nothing from you. Greet your adversaries with prayers for peace. Then chances for everyone's delight worldwide are increased 7 billion to 1. Those are very good odds.
I thought that poem was so generous, especially for some of the characters that you're writing about in Lifescapes. The husband who can't rise to the occasion after the accident, some other folks, but I thought it was very generous.
Well, thank you. And, you know, my last words are a thank to the Writers Center and Karen Kelsey and all of the amazing people in this audience who have taught me so much, just amazing amounts of fabulous inspirations. And thanks to my family. And I think that's about it.
Well, can I ask you one last thing? Is there anything, can you tell us anything more about what you're working on now?
My next book is going to be published by Shanti Arts. It's called Artscapes, and it's all poems about sculpture and paintings and music. And after that, I'm going to write a goofy book about my own view of television, never having had one as a kid, and then becoming a television producer, and then becoming a binger.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I don't know what to do next. Maybe Zach wants to come back and say something and explain what to do digitally.
That is just a wrap. I just want to thank you both for coming and sharing, Jane, your questions, Lee, your poems and your answers, and everyone who came out and asked questions and watched and participated. It's been a great evening, and I'm so grateful that you all here. So have a good evening, everybody.